Hi there, my name is Laurie Bell. I write science fiction and fantasy. I'm also a blogger, reviewer, flash fiction writer, narrator, and the author of Whitefire, a Tony Dell adventure. It's an action-packed science fiction novel following a space agent on a dangerous mission to track down gun smugglers and save the Sector 1 vice president from assassination. But everybody lies, so watch your back. There's also a robot dog and a snarky spaceship AI. Discover more about me in my books at australianbooklovers.com under science fiction. Bring sparkling wine.
Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
Welcome everybody to episode 3 of the Australian Book Lovers podcast. Our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature that spans a whole range of genres to book lovers around the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. At Australian Book Lovers, we acknowledge and respect the traditional owners and custodians of the countries on which we work. And I'm coming to you today, Veronica Strachan, fantasy and picture book writer and reader, from Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung country in Victoria.
And I am Darren Kazenko, dystopian fiction writer, science fiction writer, horror author, co-founder of AustralianBookLovers.com, as well as your co-host today. And I am coming to you from Corner Country. So Veronica, here we are, episode 3 of Australian Book Lovers podcast.
Which is fantastic. So the first 2 weren't just, an accident. We made it past. It's almost a trilogy, which is, an epic fantasy writer means that I'm nearly there.
Absolutely. And there was no bottles thrown against my windows at night. So so far, that's a good response.
Yes.
And I'm ignoring the fact that nobody actually knows where I live. But if they did, I'm sure that the night still be quiet.
Yeah. So you've narrowed it down, though, acknowledging the traditional owners. They know you're in South Australia somewhere.
Well, this is true, yes. In sunny South Australia today.
Sunny South Australia. Well, yes. See, in Melbourne, it could be sunny, but in 5 minutes, it could be raining. And particularly in spring and autumn, they are our most troubled seasons, I guess. But we do love it over here. It gives us something to talk about in Melbourne. We love talking about the weather.
Well, then, quickly diverting to the weather before we get down to business, I've always wondered then, because split ends. They're all 4 seasons in one day.
Yes.
Are they writing about New Zealand or Melbourne?
Well, I believe they're writing about New Zealand, but it is equally true for Melbourne.
Well, you can adopt it as your song.
Yeah, like we adopt many great Kiwis. We like to, adopt them as part of Australasia when they're doing fabulous things. Except, of course, when we're playing rugby or, cricket against them, then it's no. They're very separate.
Well, this is true, but it's all love and sport anyway. So many cool things to chat about today in episode 3. Now, obviously, we had a bit of a chat about the publishing industry in episode 2 and just had a bit of a snapshot about what Australian industry is looking like, how many books are being produced on a year-to-year basis, what sort of effect COVID has had on sales. It was quite interesting. And so today, I believe we're having a little bit of a look into non-fiction and some of its offshoots and the different categories, I guess, or subcategories that non-fiction can embrace. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I think this is very much your wheelhouse, having written a couple of non-fiction books yourself, and as I've probably mentioned once or twice on previous podcasts, I have been knee-deep reading non-fiction for the last year or two, mainly for research purposes. So I think it's a great subject to kick off episode 3, and 3 is a lucky number. It's a prime number.
Yep.
And, so I think for those 2 reasons alone, it's already worth celebrating this episode.
Definitely.
Done. And okay, and goodbye.
No. Interesting how many authors read non-fiction, and some of it is about research, which I know you're going to jump into in a minute, but creative non-fiction is a word that I guess is a term that I didn't really know what it was about. I thought, that sounds a bit odd, but if you look at the fabulous Wikipedia, this defines creative non-fiction. For a text to be creative non-fiction, it must be factually accurate and written with attention to literary style and technique. So, ultimately the primary goal is to communicate information like a reporter, but to shape it in a way that reads like fiction. And so it incorporates biography, autobiography, memoir, diary, travel writing, food writing, literary journalism, chronicles, personal essays. I also found a website called creativenonfiction.org based in the US, and they summed it up really nicely, which is true stories well told. I thought, look, that's fantastic. So of course, you start to dive down the rabbit hole, and
as you do, yes,
as you do, there's kind of two sides to it. There's the personal side, which tends to be, memoir and those kind of things. But there's also a public side, which is apparently referred to as narrative or literary journalism. It's the big idea stories. So the distinction being that, between the personal and the public is that memoir is the writer's particular story and nobody else's, and the writer owns it. But in contrast, the public side of creative nonfiction is mostly somebody else's stories. Anybody really potentially owns it, and anybody who wants to go to the time and trouble to write about it. So that was interesting. And then just final little piece in the creative nonfiction is there was a nice article I read by Lee Kaufman on the Writers Vic website. And she actually gives you 7 steps for writing creative nonfiction. So if you've got a story in your mind that's based on fact, it would certainly be worth having a look at this. And she's got, as I say, 7 tips. But, one of the most interesting ones is that some advice from somebody called Robin Hemley, who in his book about creative nonfiction, the title being Immersion, he wrote, "It's possible to be completely honest about yourself and at the same time selective and manipulative in the details you choose for the sake of keeping the prose focused." So, you reveal the emotional truth of your stories without boring your readers. So even though it's true and based on facts, you can be selective in what you share. So you shape yourself into a character, and be honest but not too honest, those kind of things. So it's a great article to read. I recommend people have a bit of a look there. And
it does sound like a good article. And I think, by eliminating some aspects of a biography, say if you are writing a memoir, I suppose those elements that we choose to keep out for whatever reason, mysterious reasons, I guess that would lead on to another genre called exposés, because that information would come out. And as you mentioned, it would no longer be the writer's story, but it'd be someone talking about somebody else's story. But look, I've always juggled between, as a reader anyway, I haven't written any nonfiction, but I definitely enjoy memoirs and biographies, autobiographies as well. I also love a lot of science books, philosophy, even to a certain degree, religious and spiritual texts, and historically speaking, I suppose, on the effects of different beliefs and whatnot throughout history. But I think in my mind, nonfiction kind of falls into 2 categories, and one is a representation of knowledge, or at least an investigation of knowledge, and it could be about beliefs, or it could be about anything to do with the world, I suppose, but without an emotional context. Or you have, like, for example, a memoir or an experience of a real life event, but it comes with the emotions that are important to that particular event, because of the person who's writing it may have experienced or investigated those emotions through different accounts that lead to it. So it is crazy how many different nonfiction styles there are out there. But for myself, just if I were to quickly write down a hard sentence, I would think that for myself, that the 2 categories in my head are ones with emotion and ones, so I guess really subjective and objective. It comes back to that cliche.
It's a good way to look at it.
And, we were chatting a little bit beforehand, before hitting the old famous red record button. But I think we both come from, when it comes to doing research, and which often relies on looking into nonfiction of all its different facets and different subcategories. It did start with a library, visits to the library, and or encyclopedias, I think we were chatting about. So, dust off
before the internet, yes. Admitting that I'm that old.
But even the libraries before the internet, and obviously we've transitioned, and it's such a huge transition. I mean, I used to love, back at my early uni days, doing research and snuggling up with a philosophy book or a science book, but because the library was open late every night, and I could go over there and You know, you can sit there with the dark outside and, you know, softly lit desks. It's very cool. But now, of course, that's almost out the window. I mean, I still love a good library, don't get me wrong, but I would go there more for entertainment, as far as even from, you know, whatever I was looking to read, because nowadays, you know, the internet really is it's become such a vital tool for research. And I wonder if that creates a slippery slope, because pre-fast internet, I guess, or pre-fast communications and internet, you know, a lot of primary sources, even back then, were usually, due to technological restraints, they're reflections that were all recordings, you know, literary recordings. At some point, surely they must have been at the mercy of memory regardless. So depending on how far you want to look back, you're looking, even that primary source is probably at the mercy of memory, and therefore is subjective to a certain degree because of the delays in the event happening, and then those events being recorded and interpreted, etc. But now, of course, there's no subjective analysis when it comes to, for example, video. And YouTube is essentially like this high-tech memoir in action of the human race, and with lots of non-fiction and fiction in their stories. But for example, I'm wondering how today's technology may affect in the future when it comes to writing a memoir, or perhaps maybe not so much a memoir, because that's always going to be memory-based. But if you were to research somebody else's life, do you then rely on those primary sources, those videos and audio recordings, etc., that are what they are? That there's no interpretation required in the sense of that was what was spoken, or this is what you saw. Whereas, you know, previously, if looking back, you know, if you're going back a couple of generations, as far as depending on the person you're writing a biography about, you would have to rely on people's memory. I think it's non-fiction is, like everything, is going through so many changes. But I'm curious as to what will be, I guess, all that ranting and raving. My query will be, what will be our, you know, trusted source for information moving forward? You know, are we still going to rely on a good non-fiction book if we're doing research for, you know, our writing or anything in life, or do we rely more on technology now?
And how easy is it for that technology to be rewritten? You know, I think streams of 1984 and Brave New World, and also just brings me back to a conversation that I had with my son, who loves history, and at school loved ancient history, you know, really loved all of that, and thinking about how we form our opinions from the evidence left of those civilizations and how that compares with today. And this son is also a videographer. So do we, as you say, take what's there in the online world, and what will people in a couple of 100 years look at and judge our civilizations by? So, yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, if it's 2023 and someone wants to write a non-fiction book, say perhaps, of, you know, the rise of the internet, you know, do they base their information on accounts, or do they base it on the evidence, the digital evidence that in theory haven't blown ourselves up by then and is still there? What would become more important? And I just wonder what would become more important, because, you know, an account may not give the right details, but then like you said, the data can be manipulated to such a degree. I mean, we're down the rabbit hole of deep fakes now. So I think there's something concrete still today in, you know, if there's a really important aspect of writing, you know, something that has to be spot on, then I think the library is still the gold standard. Because if you find a book or a reference book or some sort of non-fiction book, when I say library, I mean traditional print, like printed hardback, softback books, you know, in essence, you can always go to the sources at the back. And I think that's such an important trail, because if you feel that the author of one particular book got it right or got it wrong, you can see what books did they read to come to that conclusion. Absolutely. I was just going to say, it reminds me, even fiction writers, so important to get your books registered with the National Library of Australia, so that they are there for posterity, so that there is a copy of them kept. Even if your family or your descendants chuck out your notes and your manuscripts and your books, the National Library will keep a copy for you. So yes. Good point. Excellent point. Well, for our budding authors, our existing authors and our readers out there, have you got any hints or tips when it comes to writing or approaching the process of writing a non-fiction book?
It depends very much, as you said, on what you're writing. For me, writing a memoir the beginning was transcribing my journal notes. I kept notes that I'd written to all my children from, when they're born all the way through, for a number of years, and just transcribing those. And then because I was looking at them some 20 to 30 years later, it was that creative part, which was reliving some of those memories and some of those feelings, but writing a story that connected all those journal things. So for me, it started with the facts, and with what I had in front of me, that evidence was the journals. And then I've also written a self-help book, which was based a little bit upon the Breathing While Drowning, which was my memoir, but also very much based on my experience as a coach and as a change agent, and, doing leadership workshops and facilitation. So it was about the things that I'd felt in my own experience, and then mapping those out, going through and researching other bits and pieces and looking at other tools and things, and again going down the rabbit hole, but trying to find things that had worked for me, and then getting permission for a few of them to use from the original creators. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's how I started with the self-help workbook as well.
You mentioned obviously doing a little bit of research for the self-help book. Can you remember if there was much of a division as far as what research you performed online versus what research you may have performed face-to-face?
That's interesting. It's probably was a bit of a mix. Let's say it was probably a 30-70. So I had lots of books about leadership, lots of books about change, and had read, a lot of books about finding yourself and understanding yourself better. There was a fantastic book by a woman called Maureen Murdoch, which was The Heroines Journey, and based on, many people would know Joseph Campbell's the Hero's Journey, which they say a lot of books are based on. When Maureen Murdoch went to Joseph Campbell, he was, in her area. She said, well, what about, where are women in this story? And, famously, he said to her, well, women don't need to go on the hero's journey because they're at the end of the story, and of course she was not happy with that at all, understandably, as many women said, what? And so she went and, again, she did a stack of research, and she had been a family therapist, or, was a family therapist, did look at a whole lot of social sciences and all those kind of things, and then formed her own. And so from that, having read that and had some epiphanies myself, I could see what worked for me, and I was able to kind of match it up. And from there, I looked at some of the research in the back of her books and followed up, as you mentioned, checked references and read original articles, and then from there started to do some online research, probably about 30-70.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I would have thought, well, my guess would have been a little bit more even, but no, that sounds like a unique split. And what about if you were to do another book, whether it be another non-fiction book while we're on non-fiction, would you still rely on that sort of split, or do you think now you shift more one way or the other?
Again, it depends on what I was doing. As my husband has been writing some books, some family history books, and so for him it's about the paperwork. So it's documents, it's births, deaths and marriages, it's an invoice for the first deposit on a home that his mum and dad had. It's
definitive paper
definitive stuff. It's looking at old letters written by bosses and those kind of things. I've got a reference of my grandmother's where they say that she's a very proper, and she's been a good worker, and they would recommend it to whoever, written by her first boss when she was 16, in the very early 1900s. So he's got a lot of paper evidence, and from that he's putting it together. So he's probably 30-70 the other way, whereas the 30% that he does online is he looks up the places and he tries to see who was behind that particular association of British immigrants when they came out, that sort of thing. So
yes. But and I think that's definitely a really cool thing about the internet, because obviously we chatted about data being able to be corrupted, but as far as researching the tools required to get us from point A to point B, no matter what you're writing, or, hey, we're a writing podcast. So when it comes down to write a story, whatever the genre it is, if you're doing a little bit of research, but sometimes the tools you need, so for example, which department does this, or who would look after this kind of information. It's more like almost like a directory of where to find the direction you need, a directory of the services that you might be able to use to get that information you're after. More so for non-fiction, I'm guessing, and even more so for a family history. Absolutely. But for example, I might look up how to insert binary code in blood cells or in DNA, for example. But there's obviously 101 opinions on it. But using the internet, I can find perhaps some of the, not definitive, but some of the most well-regarded actual science-based books that study that subject, or perhaps the most up-and-coming theories that are believed to be the best. And then I'll move away from the internet and hunt down that book.
Yes.
So rather than rely on because again, I feel more confident with a book when I want to really get down to the nuts and bolts, because you've got those references. And once you find one book, sometimes all those references, that's your reading for the next 6 months. But yeah, so it can be an awesome tool for that, without the fear of learning something that's completely incorrect, which I think was still just as much of a risk. I think we were having a bit of a laugh earlier, saying that if we did have, back in the school days, if doing a project, and if we did have to do a bit of research, yes, sometimes that encyclopedia would come out because the libraries aren't open at 7 on a Monday night.
That's right.
And it could be 1984, but the encyclopedia might be copyright 1978. So the information learning then, it could even be corruptible in the sense of time gets in the way, and new matters come to light when it comes to knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of our listeners out there may be wondering what inspired our discussion today on nonfiction or creative nonfiction, and the different elements that come with nonfiction, and obviously research, etc. Well, it happens to be because we've got a very special guest today for the author interview.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about it.
Well, first of all, dear listeners, this is the first author interview by myself.
Yes.
So this is a debut. No, it was a fantastic discussion, or chat, should I say. Now, the author is a lady by the name of Dale Lorna Jacobsen. Now, Dale actually has 4, I believe, titles currently on Australian Book Lovers Library, and all books are listed under the Aussie Tales, and all would probably fall in, I guess, what you would call either memoir or creative non-fiction, hence our discussion today.
Yes.
So I thought I'd just quickly give everybody a brief overlay of some of the book titles that she submitted, kindly enough, and a very, very short synopsis, so you get an idea of the kind of work that Dale pens. So the first title we've got is called Being Lucy, the Story of a Recluse. Now, this story is based on the life of Lucy Strobridge from Brookville in the Gippsland Mountains of Victoria. Some said she was mad, others said she was brave, but possibly she was simply being Lucy, living her life her way. Very interesting story, as you'll hear in the interview, and I'll let Dale explain the inspiration behind that one. Second title we've got is called Yenahan's Legacy, a high country story. Now, Yenahan's Legacy is a fascinating mix of adventure and history in which tales of pioneers, aborigines, and a modern-day women interweave. Fran's life changes over the course of a weekend as she helps restore a hut in the high country of Australia. Haunted by ghosts of previous occupants, she is drawn to their stories and seeks the truth, finding love in the process. Now, for a complete left turn, I guess, from that sort of atmosphere that's already building with her work, we've got a title called Union Jack. Now, this dramatic political novel features a cast of rogues, opportunists, and idealists set against a background of corruption, strikes, and union bashing in Queensland. Yet this is not the 1980s, but the 1920s, and Jack O'Leary, socialist, rail worker, and fiery unionist, befriends Fred Patterson, a young lawyer who has joined the newly formed Communist Party of Australia. To jump from political turmoil in the Queensland early history, we're going to jump to her final title, which is available on AustralianBookLovers.com, Antarctic Engineer, a memoir of John Russell. Now, I learned a new term today. This is, it's an acronym, ANAIR, which is Australian National Antarctic Research Expeditions.
Yes.
So, as a member of ANAIR, now John actually wintered at Macquarie Island in 1949, Heard Island in 1952, and was part of a 10-man team to set up Australia's Mawson Station in 1954.
Mm-hmm.
He was Traverse Specialist at McMurdo during Deep Freeze number 4 in 1958 and was awarded the Polar Medal in 1956 for serving 13 months below 60 degrees, as in geographical, at Mawson Station. Now, this memoir was written, co-written, or written between John and Dale when John was in his 99th year, which is an amazing achievement and just a beautiful, I guess, opportunity to capture something so wonderful.
Mm.
So definitely a few different avenues to explore there, I think.
Yes, that's very broad.
Yeah, definitely. So without further ado, perhaps, rather than me keep getting tongue-tied, I will let Dale do most of the talking because I do a little bit. But no, she was a fantastic guest, an absolute pleasure. And I can't wait for everybody to have a listen. So here we go. Hello, Dale Lorna Jacobsen, and thank you so much for being a part of the Australian Book Lovers podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to be chatting with you.
Hello, Darren. Oh, look, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be here too. I love your website. I love everything you're doing.
Oh, that is such good feedback, and I hope we can do bigger and better things for everybody this year. That's for certain. But it's feedback like that really made everything worthwhile, because it has been a bit of a big mission to start with, but we're here now. This is the fantastic part where we get to talk to Australian authors like yourselves. So now I should probably let our listeners know that you are actually my very first author interview, as I mentioned earlier. But not only that, you're also one of our most prolific authors, having submitted not one, not two, not three, but 4 fantastic titles to our website library. Now, I know there's at least one more title out there. So I guess my first question for you, Dale, is how long have you been writing with such passion for?
Well, actually, since I was 8 years old. However, for my real author style writing for about 20 years.
Okay, excellent. And what triggered that move to go from possibly hobby to really pushing these, dramatic and excellent books?
Well, I left Brisbane where I was working. I was with Griffith University, and I decided that I wanted to live in the bush. So my partner and I sold up and moved to the bush. We then, we were instrument makers at that time, so we went off-grid and did what we did best. But there was a book that was nagging at me that really needed to be written, and it was called, well, it wasn't called anything at that time. It later became Union Jack. And it was a story about my grandfather, but not in the usual way of a story about my grandfather. He was involved in the Australian Railways Union, and they exposed malfeasance of the then Queensland Labor government. Ended up in civil trial and Royal Commission and all the rest of it. And the Premier and Federal Treasurer lost their seats and lost their standing in the Labor Party, and it was all because of my grandfather and his union that did it. And wow. I really wanted to get to the bottom of that. I was a member of the Brisbane Labor History Association, and it just seemed timely that I should do this. So one day I said to Doug, my partner, you can have the workshop all to yourself. I'm going to chain myself to a computer and I'm going to write this damn thing. Well, I didn't realise it would actually take 10 years to be able to research it and get it all together. There was so much that I didn't know, and it was my first attempt at serious research and writing. So it was a steep learning curve.
Not to mention a huge undertaking.
It was. Yeah, I then was searching for a publisher, but in the meantime, another story presented itself, and that became Yenuan's Legacy. So sort of one fed into the other. They leapfrogged, between publishing and writing.
Fantastic. Now, you describe Union Jack as a dramatic political novel featuring a cast of rogues, opportunists and idealists set against a background of corruption, strikes and union bashing of Queensland 1920s. I wasn't aware that it was also based on your grandfather's efforts to expose these sorts of things. So it makes me wonder, do you think we need your grandfather here today to look at today's state of government as we go through the times we're going through?
Oh, he'd be shuddering. He'd be rolling in his grave.
You could be right there.
He would be totally disillusioned in the state of, well, the Labor Party and everything political that's happening in the whole world, you know. I'm glad he's not here to see it, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I guess it's, like you said, it's all political parties. I think things are just a little bit unsettled globally at the moment, and
Yes.
even right here in Australia. But you mentioned with yourself and your partner decided to go bush and off the grid. Now, that is something I can understand. My uncle, or late uncle, should I say, did live off the grid, and which was always fun to see how that works. It was all solar power, etc. But now I wonder, that leads me to have a chat with you about a story that certainly has an intriguing premise, and that's your book titled Being Lucy.
Yes.
Obviously, it has something to do with isolation and being off the grid to a
He
certain
was
extent.
definitely off the grid.
Yeah, well, so from what I've read, Lucy has been known by two unique descriptions, known either as the Maid of the Mountains or Loony Lucy.
Right,
So I have to ask, what drew you to delve into the strange life of Lucy Strobridge?
Well, I'll tell you the story if you've got time.
I would love to hear, and maybe let the listeners know a little bit about what Being Lucy is
Yes.
about, because it really is intriguing.
It is. I belong to an organisation called the Kosciuszko Huts Association, and their role is to preserve the history of the high country huts, and not just the huts, but the people who inhabited them and who built them. Now, when was it? I think it was 2005. Look, I can't remember, but anyway, it was a long time ago. There was a group of us camping in Victoria in the high country at Omeo, and we spent 10 days visiting various huts just to assess their condition, but also to see the ones that we normally wouldn't see. Anyway, on the second day, we went to there were two huts side by side on the forestry track leading up to a mountain called Mount Delusion. Fantastic name. If you're a writer, you've got to have something with Mount Delusion in it. Anyway.
Well, considering what I've read, the description of Being Lucy, Mount Delusion suddenly seems somewhat fitting.
It does, yeah. Anyway, there was a front hut that was made of weatherboards, horizontal weatherboards, and a tin roof, and it was pretty old. But behind it, there was a half fallen down slab hut with a bark roof, and we went inside, and it was dark and blackened from the sort of a fireplace that was in the corner. When I say fireplace, there wasn't a fireplace; it was just a heap of ash. You know, the fire had been lit on the floor of the hut, and our leader at the time, the work party leader, told us a story how this 5 years before a woman had died. She was 81. Her name was Lucy, and there were like spider webs hanging down, and the roof was all propped up with sticks, and it was unbelievable that someone could have actually lived there. And there was a book written called Maid of the Mountains, and it sort of told really the history of the Strobridges more than just Lucy. Right. Lucy didn't feature largely in it, but it was sort of a couple of chapters on Lucy. Anyway, so then I couldn't let the feeling of Lucy go. It was, I mean, I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but really her spirit was in that hut. There was no doubt, you know. So sorry
to interrupt, Dale. When you say that, so when you come across this hut and you take in the atmosphere and the scenery, what sort of mood did it bestow upon you? What about it gave you that feeling that's obviously triggered something passionate about looking into it more?
I looked at the hut and the bush around outside and tried to imagine what it would be like living there myself. And I could imagine it because I'm a bit of a recluse myself, and it was like, she was dead, but it was like Lucy was hanging around behind the trees watching us.
Wow.
And it was a really spooky feeling. I came home and, her story wouldn't leave me. And what I always do in any book I write, I start off with about a 5,000 word short story just to get the story arc and to see if it's got any legs. So I wrote the short story, and Lucy was there digging me in the ribs saying, come on, you can write more than that. So eventually I did. And Doug and I went back down to Omeo for a couple of weeks to camp down there and to interview anyone who had any relationship. Well, no one had any relationship with Lucy. She didn't want to speak to anyone. She didn't want to have anything to do with anyone. But the small community of Swifts Creek, which is where she lived, really looked out for her. And everyone that I interviewed was very guarded to start with, saying, like I was going to write something, a sensationalist story or something. And I said, no, look, I want to get inside Lucy's head and I want to write basically as a novel, but only use the facts that I have. And there were also a lot of myths growing up, even in just a short time. People were starting to say stories that weren't true, and the fact that she was called Loony Lucy, for example. She wasn't. She was a very intelligent woman. I think she was on the spectrum, and I think that is probably where it all stemmed from. And there was also people I interviewed without naming names. They said, I hope you get this story right. What's been written isn't exactly what I said before, So
just add a little bit of pressure.
Yeah. So that's how it came about, and I did, and I sent the manuscript to all the people that I interviewed just to make sure to get their feedback, because I don't like getting things wrong.
That's fantastic. It says here in your description, or your description of the book, some said she was mad, others said she was brave. But from what I understand, it was Lucy and her mother that lived out there to start with, but they lived separately, side by side. Is that right?
It is. Theirs is a very, very complex relationship, and that's one of the main things that I featured throughout the book. The mother was highly religious, and Lucy wasn't. Lucy also wouldn't speak, and it was from the time when she was about 12, when her brother died, she just refused to speak. And when I interviewed her nephew, he said that he's pretty sure she had a speech impediment and didn't like being laughed at, and because of that she didn't speak, because people would go past the hut, bushwalkers and they'd hear her singing. So obviously she had vocal cords but just did not speak, and she just communicated by writing notes to anyone that she needed to communicate with.
Well, it's...
and the mother was quite domineering in some regards, and Lucy had a fierce temper. So between the two of them, it was like putting a match to dynamite.
And yet how long did they live together before she was on her own?
Right up till the mother died.
Yeah, wow.
About 30 years before Lucy died.
Wow. So it definitely would have been an interesting, like you said, an interesting relationship, probably very unique.
That's right.
And in a time when, what other options are there as far as entertainment, or they're out bush, they're remote, and it does make, I know it's going to make for some fascinating reading, especially when you throw in, possibly a dominant religious mother, and a young girl who can sing but refuses to talk, and the townsfolk, by the sounds of it, that all said and done, you could say they're quite protective of Lucy.
Totally protective, and they still are.
So she must have found a way to make an impression on the people. That's definitely for sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that's Being Lucy, the story of Recluse, and I understand you're going to be so kind enough as to do a small reading a little bit later on from that book.
I'd love to.
I can't wait to listen to that. But everyone, if you're interested in Being Lucy, obviously you can find that in our Aussie stories and non-fiction section of AustralianBookLovers.com. But what I'd like to move to now is The Antarctic Engineer, so the John Russell memoir that you wrote.
Yeah.
Something that is very fascinating and opens up a whole world of questions and tales I'd like to hear from you. But we'll start with the fact that it is a memoir. And I understand that you worked with Mr. John Russell when he was 99 for this memoir,
Yes,
is that correct?
That's right, yep.
That is amazing. And not only that, but I understand John's love of Antarctica was triggered by, was it a dinner or a tea with Lady Shackleton?
Yes, well, that was the second contact when he was 8. Now, look, 8 seems to be such an influential age because that's when I discovered writing, that's when I discovered Antarctica, that's when John discovered Antarctica. So anyone who's got 8-year-old kids out there, whatever happens to them at 8 probably will govern the rest of their lives.
There you
Anyway,
go.
John lived in London, and he was at the Dulwich Prep School, which is a Dulwich College's and one day his headmaster collected the school, the class, marched them across the road to the Dulwich Senior College, and they all sat down in a hall and cross-legged on the floor as they would have done, and then they were there to see a magic lantern show that was put on by Leonard Hussey, who was one of Shackleton's men when the Endeavour went down and sunk.
And that in itself is an absolute mind-boggling for me tale of endurance.
That's right. It is.
Don't mind the pun, and just the willingness to survive and what a man or lady or anybody would do to not only protect themselves but to save their crew. But yeah.
Oh yeah, stunning story. Everyone should read it, whether you like Antarctica or not.
Oh, absolutely agree, 100%.
Yeah. Anyway, when John saw these slides of the continent, they were Frank Hurley's slides, and that slideshow, by the way, that Magic Lantern show, is still shown in England today. Exactly the same one with exactly the same script. Anyway, he was fascinated, and he kept asking his father questions, and his father said, "I don't know the answers." And then one day he said, "Look, Lady Shackleton doesn't live far away from here. Why don't you write to her and ask her the questions?" Because Sir Ernest had died a couple of years before. So he wrote a letter to Lady Shackleton, and she invited him for afternoon tea. So he hopped on he was about 12 by this stage, hopped on his push bike, rode the 7 miles to Lady Shackleton's house, and during that afternoon tea, she said that Ernest had said to her that now that they're in the machinery age, what is most important to him is not someone who's got a degree in biology or geology, but mechanics, people who know how to drive these machines, but more importantly, how to maintain them in such a hostile environment. So John went home, said to his dad, "I'm going to be an engineer." And that was it. From that moment on, he worked towards getting to Antarctica, and it took him till 1949 before he finally got there, but he did eventually.
And when we're talking about, obviously, Sir Douglas Mawson and his absolutely astronomical journey and the trials and tribulations he went through, and obviously Ernest Shackleton with Endeavour and John Russell, these are times when, I mean, we're so used to having easy contact to be able to, even if you're isolated, you can still feel as though you have some sort of connection and therefore some sort of safety, because communication is so satellite linked now, etc. But even, I can't imagine in the 40s and going back further than that, to travel to such a mysterious, which would have to have been such a mysterious land,
Yes.
And with whose main popularity or what most people would have known would have come from Douglas Mawson's Shackleton, which, although life-changing stories, weren't exactly the kind of thing you want to put on a postcard to say bring the family and come on.
No.
So I think it takes such a special kind of person to make a life decision and dedicate their life to working towards not only getting there, but I guess, like you said, the mechanics and expanding and enhancing the tools for all of us moving forward from those explorer days to open up those territories.
That's right. And as John said, and it's so true, without the engineers and the DISOs, the diesel mechanics, they sort of interchangeable, the bases wouldn't exist, because the machinery, the generators, everything that makes it possible to live down there, particularly over a winter, is all maintained by the DISOs. And without them, they wouldn't have the same access to things that they have now.
No, well, like Shackleton's crew, they'd be hunting down seals for blubber for that little bit of fuel.
Yes, that's right.
Put a small fire in their wet soaking tents on the side of rocks. So I'll definitely take diesel generated heat and movement over that.
Yeah.
But with regards to writing writing a memoir, working on a memoir, as you did with John Russell for Antarctic Engineer, how different is I guess you could say, the creative process, the literary process, the writing process in general? Did you work with him on passages, notes, or manuscript that he'd already prepared, or did together you go through his memories and recreate? Or
well, a bit of everything. And as far as the writing, to me, writing is about making good sentences. Now, whether it's creative non-fiction or fiction or non-fiction, you need to be able to write a good sentence. So that, to me, that's the creative part, getting that right. What we did with John, one of the do you know what the Inari Club is? I shall explain.
No,
that.
I can't say I do.
No, okay.
I'm about to.
Inari is the Australian National Antarctic Research Expedition, and that's the name given to expeditioners who go down to Antarctica to conduct science. They are part of the division, the Australian Antarctic Division. Now, a lot of those I say old, but returned expeditioners, particularly the ones who've wintered there, they formed about, 70 years ago, they formed a club called the Inari Club, which is a club of expeditioners who had wintered in Antarctica, Australian expeditioners. So the Inari Club, I'm an associate member because while I've been to Antarctica 3 times, I've never actually worked there.
Well, that was definitely something I want to chat to about in a second too.
Yeah. But so one of the old expeditioners, Trevor Luff, who lives not far from me up in the Sunshine Coast, he spent 5 years over time interviewing John and getting really high quality recordings of his memories.
Oh, okay.
At this stage, it was 99 when I came onto the scene. So from about 95 on, he was recording, because his memory is absolutely sharp. He can relate conversations that he's had, people, dates, times, everything. So Trevor had all this stuff, and then John had also, in 1985, he'd typed up, or his wife had typed, he wrote quite a substantial little manuscript on his life, not just Antarctic life, but that was included in it, and it was for his family. So what I did when I came on board, I got all these tapes and then got his memoir that he'd written, the notes that he'd written, and then drew it all together. Now, my main part was to, apart from writing good sentences, was to get on to the division and verify all the people, all the places, the ships, everything, to make sure that he'd got it right. And he had, in 99% of the time, he might have been out by a month or two occasionally, but everything that he remembered was pretty close.
That's incredible.
So yeah, so I then began to write it, and as I wrote a chapter, because he's not on computer, I would print it out and send it to him. He'd send it back scribbled all over, you know, adding things or changing things or whatever. I also sent it to 5 other Antarctic expeditioners who are in the Inari Club, just to get another perspective on it. And then we drew it all together. I went down to John's quite a few times, and I interviewed him myself, but it's mainly just to have a cup of tea and let him talk, you know, because there's nothing like being there in the same room to capture the spirit of it all.
Well, it must have been very exciting to be cross-referencing and obviously therefore reaching out to other people that have, you know, done all these expeditions and just bringing them all to life and hearing everybody's memories of it.
That's right. Talk about a dream job for an Antarctica file.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask, because I understand you've said in your bio that you can find, I'm sure in other places, but also on AustralianBookLovers.com, a small bio. In 2013, you did fulfil a lifelong dream, and you yourself took part in an expedition to Antarctica.
Yes.
And that also resulted in an ebook production of Why Antarctica, a Ross Sea Odyssey, which I understand also has a whole heap of photography and videos.
Yes.
Now, I guess part A of my question, what drew you to Antarctica? Is it something, you mentioned that, you know, 8 years old is a good age to look forward. Has ice and the land down there been something, a part of your dreams or your hopes for a long since you were a kid?
Totally. When I was 8, my teacher had an obsession with Antarctica, and it was leading up to the International Year of, what was it? IGY, International Geophysical Year, and they. I'll just close my window because the rain's coming down and I've got a tin roof.
Oh, there we go. We are talking to you in the top tropical half of Australia, so these things are to be expected.
So I hope the rain doesn't intrude here. Anyway, my teacher over the year taught us all about Antarctica, and I've always loved mountains and cold places and ice and snow. And I found out that here was a whole continent that had all those things that I love. And I've always liked remote places and camping in the bush, you know, all that sort of stuff. So I discovered, and then I then spent the rest of my life, literally, well, my life so far, reading everything I could on Antarctica, just like John did, I suppose, and just anything I could. And if you get Antarctica, then you understand the deep obsession. It's like an ache right in your belly. I knew I had to go there before I died. I didn't know how I would ever get there, but I did. I am an environmental scientist, but at the time when I could have steered my life towards Antarctic research, there were other things going on, so I couldn't. And
they do say life is what happens while you're making plans.
Exactly. So anyway, I finally got there. My mum, when she was 90, she was in her last days in hospital. She was very happy to be going. You know, she'd led a wonderful life. And she said to me one day, "You won't be a millionaire, but you will get your trip to Antarctica."
Oh, I know which one I'd choose.
She said, "I want you to go, and before I die, I want you to go and research it and find out what your trip's going to be, because I want to enjoy seeing you do it." Anyway, so I went and found out that there was this 32-day trip that was led by the wonderful Australian mountaineer and geologist Greg Mortimer. And I thought, oh, that's it, you know, that's my trip. So I was telling Mum all about it, and she said, "Well, have you booked?" And I said, "I can't, Mum, you're not dead yet." We had a good joke, and that was pretty much the last conversation we had. She
really?
Sort of went into Noddy Land after that and died not long after. So when I did go down, it was quite overwhelming, because particularly when I was sailing into the Ross Sea down to McMurdo Base, here was the place where Shackleton and Amundsen and Scott and Mawson and everyone had had done research from. I was sailing down to actually step into their huts, and my mum was still sitting on my shoulders, and I remember standing out the front of the ship, or the bow, and crying, but not sadness, just sort of disbelief that I'm here and I'm fulfilling this dream that I promised my 8-year-old self that I would do, you know.
That is not only amazing, that's truly beautiful. And
Yeah.
I mean, it is one dream of mine to one day to fly over. But I mean, people talk about culture shock, I suppose, when you go to other countries and you see different ways of life, or, you know, different big cities, small cities, different landscapes. But I wondered, I have to ask, when you first get to Antarctica, or when you really do spend some time there and really get to understand it, did it give you a different perspective on the planet itself?
Oh, totally.
And I can only imagine it'd be like looking down on Earth from outer space. It'd have to be a complete reset of how we look at the planet.
Absolutely. Because I travelled about a third of the coast and went on shore, of course. And it was just so unbelievably huge that you look at the mountains and the ice and you really can't get perspective. And then I thought, this is only one very small part of this continent. And it was surreal. It was unimaginatively beautiful. Just, stunning. People say, what do you want to go to all that white stuff for? It's not white. It's blue. It's brown. It's everything. It's just gorgeous. And just so, people use the word pristine obviously in the wrong way, but this was pristine. Mm-hmm. And it was, there was no one there. You knew that if you went up onto that mountain, you weren't going to find a chip packet and a crushed can of Coke, you know. Yeah. It was totally unspoilt.
Well, I think your mum would be very happy that you got there. I've no doubt about that. Yeah. But not only that, I think, you know, the smile wherever she is got even bigger when you had the opportunity to do this memoir with, not just about John Russell. So it's almost as if your quest and your dream for Antarctica opened up with even more facets, and has given you a real direct line to history. So rather than just be somebody who's visited and can say how it is now, unlike most people, you've got that intimate knowledge of earlier expeditions and Australia's place as far as our explorers and how the mechanics changed. So I think that is just unbelievable. So I'm definitely jealous. Absolutely. and I think anyone out there who's interested in Antarctica exploration or just fantastic memoirs, you know, I'll definitely be reading it. It sounds absolutely unbelievable, and as I say, I am jealous for the fact that you've been to Antarctica, and I understand more than one occasion. Yeah, you've been able to bring to life all these memories and be a part of history. So all I can say is congratulations on doing something so fantastic.
Thank you.
One final question on Antarctica: how good and cool are the penguins?
Oh, look, when I was going down, I said to everyone, look, I'm not interested in penguins or whales or seals. I'm only there for the ice and the mountains. Well, that was before I stepped onto an island, and this little gentoo penguin with apricot feet waddled up to me and said, hello. I was smitten at that point.
Okay. Was a selfie taken?
Yes.
Well, now the penguin's famous too. Now, I've done a little bit of research for my sequel. I've been doing a little bit of research in Antarctica and just extreme cold survival. But and it just becomes more. The more I read about Antarctica, the more magical it becomes. The more mysterious it becomes. It doesn't. It just grows with mystery rather than, you know, we don't illuminate facts. It seems to just keep offering more mystery, and that's just from research. I can't imagine being there.
Yeah, well, that's right. And people say, oh, it's too cold, but it's not cold. Well, Antarctica's cold, but you're not, because you're wearing the right clothing. In fact, often I was quite hot because I had, I camped on the ice one night and in a bivvy bag, and I was really quite hot, even though it was snowing on top of the bivvy bag and everything, you know.
Wow. And you mentioned, obviously we're talking to you, you're in Queensland there, north of Brisbane. Now, not very cold up there as far as conditions. So how does someone who loves snow, ice, cold weather end up in admittedly stunningly beautiful subtropics?
Well, I've been asking myself that all my life. Why aren't I at least living in Tasmania? Well, I've got family here, you know, and we did move up to the mountains of Maleny at the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast. So we're about 5 degrees cooler up here than if I was down in Brisbane, say. But I really suffer in the heat. I hate it. I absolutely hate it.
Well, we can always go to Melbourne in summer. No. Only a joke. I love Melbourne. I was born there, so I'm allowed to say that. Now, we've covered a couple of books, obviously Union Jack and the political novel featuring Castle Rogues, and obviously we just had a real big chat about Antarctica, Being Lucy, which is definitely something I'll be looking into. But I was wondering, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about Yanahan's legacy. Your description here is a fascinating mix of adventure and history in which tales of pioneers, Aborigines and modern-day women interweave.
Well, it's another Kosciuszko Huts Association story. In 1995, Doug and I spent 3 months in our Land Cruiser camping around the high country. And one weekend we were camped at a place called Mount Clear, which is at the southern end of Namadgi National Park in the ACT. And there was no one there, just us, camped in a frost hollow. It was beautiful, cool, gorgeous place. And then a bloke came in and camped next to us, and we thought, oh, damn. So we don't want anyone here. But then we noticed we got out carpenter's tools. Now, as I mentioned, Doug and I were woodworkers. We make musical instruments at that point. And we thought, well, this is really strange in the middle of a national park having carpenter's tools. So we got chatting to him over our campfire, and he was there to take part in a work party to restore a hut not far away. And this was obviously before Being Lucy, 10 years before, and we didn't know that the KHA existed. So he was telling us all about it, and we said, well, look, can we gate crash this work party? Because, you know,
there's some initiative.
We're good woodworkers, and we'd love to see the hut. So we did, and we spent the weekend in this beautiful little place, really remote place, camping outside and then working on the hut. And on the second day, I was in the bedroom. There was only 2 rooms, and I looked up, and the ceiling was missing in the bedroom. And I said to the work party leader, oh, that's a pity, we're going to have to replace all those boards. He said, no, you don't touch that, that's history. In 1922, the woman who lived here, Mary Elizabeth Shields, she died of TB, and the Murrumbidgee was in flood, and they couldn't get to the cemetery to bury her. So her husband and her kids ripped down the ceiling and made a coffin and buried her up on the hill. So
wow, that's
during a lunch
fascinating.
break, I went up on the hill, and here was this lonely little grave with a baby's grave next to it. And I looked around. It was just the most beautiful open plain, but surrounded by snow gums. And I thought, oh, wow, there's such a story here. And as I did with Lucy, when I came back to Queensland, I wrote a short story, and I thought, I really need to know more about this woman who lived here. So I went back down and stayed with the work party leader and his wife for a couple of weeks, and we went back over to the hut and all around, and I went to the National Library and got out all the old maps and sort of pieced it all together. And I thought, I don't want to tell the story of this woman, but I really want to base a novel around that. So I talked to everyone I could, grabbed as much information. And then just as I was finishing up, Mary, who was the woman I was staying with, she said, you are going to include the Aborigines in this story, aren't you? And to my shame, I hadn't thought of that. And I thought, well, this land would have belonged to them before the pioneers moved in.
Absolutely.
So I said, yes, of course I am. Anyway, I then got in touch with the Aboriginal liaison officer from National Parks, from the Tumut area, and he put me in touch with a couple of aunties from tribes around there. So we sort of talked backwards and forwards about I didn't want to tell the Aboriginal story because I'm a whitey, I can't tell that, but I wanted to tell the interface between the Aborigines and the pioneers.
Understood.
So to my mind, the best way of doing it was to have two young girls, an Aboriginal girl who was Yenuan, and then a white girl who was Ellie in my book, and they became friends. And then it's their friendship that sort of tells the story leading through about 3 different generations. And then, of course, in the story, there is a 30-something chisel-wielding woman who's taking part in the restoration of the hut, and that tells the modern angle as well. So the 3 strands all interweave through the story.
Oh, that sounds
That's
excellent.
how that came.
Well, there you go. But it seems to me, you mentioned you're a bit of a recluse and you like to live off the grid, but it does sound like also adventure and tales seem to find you.
Yes.
So, a good thing too.
Yeah, you put it out there that you want something and it comes.
Yes, there you go. But I'm wondering if you might be able to, it's obvious with a lot of these books that there's been quite extensive and thorough research, as
Yes.
part of the writing process. So it sounds like you've done a whole different range of sorts of research too, from interviews and research and, like you mentioned, maps, etc.
Yep.
I'm wondering if you had to pick a couple of real easy points for authors looking to dive into research or aspects of research, that things you've learned that are really good tips, I guess, what would they be for someone who's currently doing research or someone about to do it for the first time?
Well, one of the wonderful tools that we've got now, what we didn't have when I was doing most of my research, is Trove, which is out of the National Library of Australia.
Uh-huh.
And Trove, Trove, the website, they have digitised most Australian newspapers and a lot of old books and photos. And if you're
Really?
looking for information, that is a really good place to start.
Does that cover all national newspapers or a
Yes.
particular state?
No, right across Australia. It's a
Searchable
huge
by-
project.
Yeah, searchable by date.
Yes, you can search by date, by name. They have
That's
when
incredible.
you go on there and you find what you want. They have an transcript of what's on there, but because it's done by what's it called, the recognition, where the computers look at the type and interpret what it's supposed to be, and there's obviously mistakes, but there's a lot of enough there that you can actually see what the gist of the article is.
Mm-hmm. So the information's still there, but it may not be grammatically correct.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing, I have some, like the book I'm currently writing is about a German settlement in Maloney, and there's so much you can get from photographs. And like up here in Queensland, the John Oxley Library has a wonderful selection of photographs, most of them digitised, or you can go in there and look, but you can do an online search. I do most of my research online to start with, and then if it's something I need, I will then go and look further. But you can, if you want to know what people were wearing in a certain time, if it's in the photo, that's what they were wearing in that era, so you can get so much detail from that sort of thing.
So really go to the source for a lot of things, and you
Absolutely.
can't go wrong.
Go to primary sources always.
Yeah. And when is the next trip to Antarctica?
Oh, I'd say tomorrow if I could. Well, there's something in the wings. Well, I can't actually talk about now, but there's a very exciting project coming up that I think I've been invited to be part of. So watch this space.
Fingers crossed that you're part of our Australian book lovers community now. So hopefully that means when you get some fantastic news, we get to hear it too.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, Dale, it has been absolutely fantastic to talk with you today. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate all your time.
Oh, thanks, Darren, for
For all
having
our
me.
listeners out there, the books we've been talking about, you've got Union Jack, Yenahan's Legacy, Being Lucy, The Story of a Recluse, and Antarctic Engineer, Memoir of John Russell. And obviously you also have the Why Antarctica, a Ross Sea Odyssey, available in ebook. If you want to learn more about Dale Jacobsen, you can visit DaleLornaJacobsen.com, which is DaleLornaJacobsen.com. And you can find her on Facebook.com, Yenahan's Legacy, Facebook.com, Why Antarctica, Facebook.com, Being Lucy Book. You can also learn about it by going to AustralianBookLovers.com, having a look at one of her books and clicking Learn More, where you'll find links to those social media as well as in-depth descriptions of the books. So Dale, you did promise a little bit of a read. So first of all, or second of all, I'll just thank you once more for being my first ever author interview. So that'll always be with us. So that means, I guess, if there is a spare seat on Antarctica, just
Pick me.
yeah,
I just want to say how wonderful it is what you've done, because we sit in our little huts and we write, and we're all alone most of the time, and to have someone come from out in the ether there to say, we want to help promote Australian authors, it's just a breath of fresh air, and I thank you for that, Darren.
Oh, no problems, and not just myself, Veronica as well. Veronica
Yes,
Strachan,
of
my
course.
other half.
Veronica,
Together, yeah. And it's also it's been such a great thing from our end too, because obviously you've got the logistics of slowly putting together the website and planning forward, but when the books start coming in,
Yes.
it's been fantastic. It's like for myself, when I send you an email and I'm ready to put a new book on the website, it's like opening a present, because I love books, I love reading, and I love writing, and I've just been astounded with the range of titles. I mean, here we are, you're my very first author interview, and with your 4 books, we're covering, politics back in the 20s. We've got, Yenahan's Legacy, we've got Antarctic Adventures, we've got, was she mad or was she like a genius, beautiful lady, Lucy, and Recluse in the mountains. And that's just chatting with you today. So, the authors like yourself is what is going, which I really hope is going to make the website something truly special, because without authors like yourself, there's nothing. I can put pictures on a website, that's easy, but it's the passion, it's the love, it's just the astounding talents that's come through that's going to make it something really wonderful.
Yes. Oh, it is very exciting.
And though this is my first interview with you, I'm sure it won't be the only interview.
Anytime.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Do check out all of Dale's books on AustralianBookLovers.com, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Darren. That was a fantastic interview, and Antarctica has always been on my I want to see it list. I'm not sure if I'll get there, but it was lovely to hear all about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you probably noticed from the interview, definitely a spot, a dream place that I'd love to see one day. So, who knows what it is about it? I mean, there's so many beautiful cities around the world, and yet there's this big ice block down at the bottom of the earth, and yet that seems to be calling. So,
Yes.
And look, how fantastic is Dale, but how extraordinarily lucky and worthy and amazing is, the fact that she's already been able to visit there on more than one occasion.
Yeah,
So
jealous about that.
Yes, absolutely jealous. But we may not be hearing the last of Dale yet, so I definitely look forward to hearing her again in the future. We're also going to be having a bit of a reading from her, from one of her books a little bit later, which I believe will be popping just before some of your book reviews. So,
Very good.
yeah,
Very good.
Which book reviews were you bringing us today?
Well, this kind of fits because I've got a review of 2 of the books in the Drowned Earth series.
Oh.
And this is a series that's been published by Dead Set Press, a
That's right,
Melbourne author, Melbourne small press. And it's based on the premise that an asteroid has landed on Earth, and basically the seas have risen, and these are books based I think there's 8 in the series, they're based all around Australia, and I've read 2 of them, and it's kind of usually either just after or a couple of years after the tsunami has swamped the coastline of Australia. So, ice, Antarctica. I thought that was a nice segue. But anyway, so the Ground Earth series, there's a book by Marcus Turner and also one by Austin Sheehan. And the second one is City of Whispers, and that is a book by Katt Powers, one of our Indigenous authors, which is fantastic. Love this. This was just absolutely action-packed. So if you like assassins and magic and conspiracies and, brilliant. Really, 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 really recommend that one. You can tell I'm a fantasy lover.
Yeah, but I mean, how much can you pack into 2 simple reviews? We've got Planet Underwater, Asteroids, we've got Assassins.
Yep.
And that's just, a couple of titles from Dead Split Press and one from Katt. So
fantastic.
Yeah. There's just so much there, but I'm looking forward to hearing what the Drowned Earth series is like, because obviously being a dystopian lover, or not lover, but like a fanatic and writer, the stories look fantastic. The cover art looks amazing. I love that, and the whole concept is something that I'm really wanting to explore. But a huge thank you again to Dale for being such an absolute superstar in the interview. And as I mentioned, we're about to go to quick reading from one of her books that I'll let her introduce. And then we will be having a listen to your book reviews, and then knuckling down, getting stuff done behind the scenes of the website. We've got lots of new books coming, and we're also going to be working hard to get the next podcast episode up and running really quick too.
Yes. If you enjoyed this episode 3, and you think, I'd like to hear a bit more, please give us a review on iTunes and let us know what you liked about it. You can find us on Twitter at Australian Books, on Facebook and Instagram at Australian Book Lovers. And of course, you can always go to the website, to the contact page, and let us know what you'd like to hear or what you liked about the show. That would be fantastic.
Definitely. So, Veronica,
Darren, are we ready? Are we going to get it right this time?
This is attempt number 3. Now we haven't drilled down to the beats per minute, but I think we.
You are such a muso.
Yeah, well.
All right. Take care, everybody, and remember.
Can fit in a certain amount of beats. But yes. So I'll let you lead the charge. Attempt number 3, ladies and gentlemen. Episode 3. Our tagline. Here we go.
Yeah. Take care for now, and remember to read
more Aussie books. I think that was pretty good.
That was pretty good.
Take care, everybody.
I'd like to read a selection from Being Lucy, and this is when she is a grown woman but still fairly young. When the leaden skies are at their darkest, matching my mood, I pull on my warmest coat and ride Ginger to the top of Mount Delusion. I cannot remain in the hut beside Ma. I miss the summers on the mountain with the cattle and quietly curse Uncle Jeff for selling out. Snow gently pats on my bare head, soothing me. Ginger responds to the kick of my heel and gallops through the snow gums. The wind picks up and needles of ice sting my cheeks as I allow Ginger to have his way. His increasing speed does not frighten me, and anyway, I've no way of pulling him up before he comes to a standstill, panting and exhausted. Reluctant to leave the mountain, despite the growing storm, I turn Ginger and head down the southern side, slackening his pace to enjoy the forest that surrounds me. As we drop in altitude, snow gums slowly give way to alpine ash. There is no sharp divide. The ash begins to appear among the thinning snow gums, first one, then a couple. As their numbers grow, the snow gums hunch below the ash until they finally disappear. In their place, huge tree ferns appear at the feet of the forest giants. Birds become more vocal now there's somewhere safe for them to play and hide. As always, the destruction caused by the loggers on these slopes angers and saddens me. Knowing they have left for the season, I follow their wheel tracks as they wind through the gullies and ridges I haven't ridden for years, not since the days when I brought our cattle up this way. It is only when I am in thick ash and tree fern that I come across a structure altogether foreign in this place. Halfway down the mountainside, nestled in the protective fold of 2 ridges, stands a two-roomed hut. Its galvanised iron chimney faces the track. The weatherboards are painted red-brown, and the timber door stands ajar. I rein Ginger in and watch from behind a large trunk, barely breathing lest my presence should be discovered. Ginger flicks his ears, strained, like mine, for the sound of human activity, but there's no one about. I dismount and approach a partly open door along the far side of the hut. I push the door and sidle inside. The dim interior smells much like my own hut, damp and smoky. Pinpoints of daylight shine through the holes in the fireplace at the far end. There is just enough daylight through the windows, grown green with mould in this damp forest, to see the walls are lined with newspaper. Firewood lies stacked in the fireplace, with tins of stew and spam lined up across the mantelpiece. So they even eat the same as I do. A guitar, much the worse for wear, leans in the corner near the fireplace. I assume that this hut has been built by the loggers who spend the summers here cutting ash. I walk outside and look around. The forest grows right up to its walls, but beyond the distant gully, where once mountain spurs bristled with alpine forest, the slopes are now bare. Surprised at the fury of the storm that followed me down the mountain, I tether Ginger in the lee of the hut and run back inside. It might belong to the loggers, but I have every intention of making advantage of its shelter. I light a fire and empty a tin of stew into a battered old saucepan. Looking for water, I go outside again and find a large pond contained by an earthen bank and fed by water bubbling from a spring. Beyond the dam, a tunnel lined with rusty galvanised iron zigzags its way into the hill. I follow the tunnel into a space black as pitch. My gumboots squelch on the muddy floor. I feel something wriggle inside my boot. I hate leeches. This hole in the hillside makes my flesh crawl. For 2 days the storm rages and I remain in the forestry hut. On the second day, I pick up the old guitar and brush my fingers across its rusty strings. My ears pick up that it's out of tune, but I feel the vibrations through its back against my belly, and I feel joy. I stop the string with my finger on one of the metal strips across its neck and pluck the string again. The note changes. I try another spot on another string, and it changes again. I find I can play a tune by letting my fingers dance around it, and I pick out tunes I know. I sing and, with no one to hear me, the words come out clear to my ears.
Drowned Earth series. Scientists said that it would take 5,000 years for Earth's oceans to rise. They were wrong. After an asteroid collides with Antarctica, a tsunami devastates the world's coastal cities and escalates the melting of the ice caps. There are 8 novellas in the Drowned Earth series, and these are set in various locations around Australia, and they explore the potential consequences of such a catastrophe. They can be read in any order. Tides of War is written by Marcus Turner, and I have to say that Tides of War is aptly named, not only in the overt sense as a drowned city and violent battles for survival and power, but also in a covert sense through the emotions and actions of the protagonist Maria. I really enjoyed the roller coaster of her responses to everything old and new that the tsunami threw at her. The author has a tight and evocative prose that sketches the characters and populates the world beautifully, and just enough to keep you scampering after the action. Between the murder and mayhem are some great dialogue and reflective passages that showcase the myriad possible responses that a geo-accident of this magnitude may cause, and the author's skill. Great story, well written. Surely there's a sequel in this. Another book in the Drowned Earth series is Submerged City by Austin P. Sheehan. Submerged City held the promise of a great read even before it began. Any doubts rapidly dissolved in the turbulent waters of this post-tsunami Melbourne tale. Sheehan has taken some of Melbourne's most iconic landmarks and peppered them with a troubled cast of characters struggling to find their way in the devastation. His read of human nature is spot on as the survivors deal with natural and man-made predators. A fledgling community hangs on by a thread. The tension and trauma are blended well in a spare writing style that keeps you turning the page for the next hit. It's obvious the author knows his city well, not just the geography, but the culture that makes up its tapestry. The people feel real, the plot all too plausible, and the ending, just the beginnings. I hope there's more to the tale of Emma, David, Sal and crew. A great read. My only complaint, it was too short. Sequel, please. If you're looking for the perfect mix of action and magic, then City of Whispers, Imperial Assassin No. 1 by Katt Powers is the perfect mix. Wow, what an action-packed ride. Assassin Danny Karim, or should I say disgraced assassin Danny Karim, leaps off the page, grabs you by the throat and never lets go. Danny and the supporting cast are fully imagined. They interact seamlessly with their brilliantly intricate world, their geography, the politics, religions, cultures, and of course, conspiracies, murders, and betrayals. Then Powers has threaded a unique magic system that fits the complex and multi-layered tale perfectly. I love the hints of backstory that offer glimpses of the flawed and fabulous characters and set the reader up for more sharp and snarky prose from Powers in future books. This is a great read.
Let's meet again. Where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.